Does he mind having his dirty linen washed in public? Is he ever going to write another book?" Zac's answers were well rehearsed and non-committal. Yes, he'd met Wynn Staniland. He'd visited the author and his daughter at their home, Addis Acre, on a number of occasions. And yes, Wynn was happy to cooperate with the biography. But it had been made quite clear to Zac that one subject was strictly off-limits, and that was the death of Wynn's wife. This was quite understandable, Zac said. A biographer shouldn't be in the business of resurrecting painful memories just for the sake of selling a few more copies of the book, which, incidentally, will be out next spring, published by Bream and Seeger, priced at £18.99. Zac's reply to the audience's final question had been more vague. Wynn hadn't altogether ruled out writing another novel. But that's all he was at liberty to say for the moment. As the last stragglers trickled out of the room, Zac tidied his papers and returned them to his leather shoulder bag, before complimenting the librarians who'd organised his talk with their customary efficiency. They hadn't been sure how many people to expect, but as it turned out the subject of Wynn Staniland had attracted quite a crowd, all fascinated to get the lowdown on the reclusive author's private life and to find out why, after 5 award-winning books that had taken the literary world by storm, Wynn Staniland had suddenly turned his back on fame and chosen to live the life of a recluse. Zac, reluctant to spoil the revelations in his book, had dropped tantalising hints, but he'd been careful to give little away. After saying his farewells, he stepped into the night. Aware that he needed to go over the latest draft of the opening 5 chapters first thing the next morning. Since he'd taken on the biography, there had been draft after draft to be pored over like some precious sacred tome. Then, of course, Wynn would want to give it his nod of assent, or otherwise adding ideas and taking others away. Zac's previous subjects had never been so particular. But then they'd been sportsmen, TV personalities, or actors, happy to go along with anything he suggested. Writing about Staniland, the author he'd admired so much during his teenage years, had seemed like a dream when he'd first gained the great man's approval for the project. It couldn't feel less like one now. Zac walked straight back to the tiny cottage near the town centre he was renting for the duration. It was up a steep, narrow street, a 1-in-3 hill. He took a deep breath before attempting the climb, contemplating the bottle of single malt waiting for him on the coffee table, his reward for a hard day's work. When the cottage came into view, he stopped to catch his breath for a few moments, suddenly reluctant to carry on. With everything that had happened over the past days, the cottage had ceased to be his haven. A serpent had crept in, curling itself round the foundations, slithering over his sleeping body. He had the sensation of being watched, but every time he looked round there was nobody there. Although he told himself it was all in his imagination, the question always nagged at the back of his mind. What if somebody had discovered the truth about who he really was? He'd been assured it could never happen, but those promises were starting to seem hollow. He felt vulnerable, more vulnerable than he'd felt since he'd been reborn as a new creation. As he approached the cottage, he took his key from his pocket. Then he saw the damage, splinters of wood around the lock, as though somebody had taken a chisel to it. For a brief moment he contemplated calling at the neighbouring houses to ask whether anybody had seen or heard anything suspicious. But his front door stood down a small side passage, invisible from the street. His heart pounded as he unlocked the door, and when it swung open, he hovered on the threshold for a few moments before flicking on the light switch. As far as he could see, nothing had been disturbed, which meant that whoever had tried to break in hadn't succeeded. Either that, or they'd gone about their business with neat professionalism. His hands were shaking as he took his phone from his pocket, wondering whether to report it to the police. It took him a few moments.